6.2 degrees, but you're only allowed 6.4. Now we're going to do a penalty on you, and they realize now that the tolerance is quite big, because sometimes you can't even say if left and right is the same. But this would be a reason. Those dive sticks are little on an angle like that, and of course if the glider stands like that, that higher dive stick is a lot higher than this one, just to keep it in your head. So I'm talking about numbers a lot. Now you guess, what is a safe setup, you know? I can give you the numbers for light speeds because we have done a German test on those RS gliders. They are, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. This is just the most recent light speed. We went there, RS4, you know, you might know it's my glider. And we tested and we passed with 7.5 degrees on the outside and 5.5 on the inside. That is for the full VG setup that we normally have in the comms. Now if you would say, what does that mean to my older light speed? What does it mean to another size? Or what does it mean to an Aeros glider? We would have to say the numbers would be comparable, but they will not be the same. At the Europeans we had a little bit of that conflict discussion because some manufacturers didn't have any duty signal yet, like Icarus. It's not that their gliders didn't fly there, but they didn't have the duty signal yet. So they would just go by our numbers. And I said, that will not work because your glider flies higher profiles, you have a little less sweep, you will of course have higher washout angles required to get the enough pitch. But we didn't have any better, so they said, well, somewhere around 7.5 and 5.5. You know? Same thing for the Aeros, you know, they would, I know it then from the guy who made the duty signal with the Aeros, they have also a little more camber on the outer profiles. You who has Aeros gliders know those. In that area they have a lot more profile than the light speed, means that will usually pick up that tail a little more, and consequently you need 8.8 degrees and 6.5 for certification in Germany. It doesn't mean that glider is less performing. You know, it's just the package needs, you know, on higher camber profiles you also need more washout, you know. So they perform very similar and the difference would be in something else, but usually you can make a glider with say 9 degrees washout perform just as well as a glider with say 7. The reason why our gliders, Morse gliders, have less of this washout angle required is that our profiles are more friendly, and I like this setup for the reason when things go really wrong, that profile moment is usually the one that gives you the most trouble, and the less that moment is, the less you really need the washout. So when you get a really hard shock on your dive sticks and they get pushed below a limit, then like you would have to say in the old days, airwave gliders for instance had very high camber, you know, as soon as you would get negative, that wing would just appear in front of you. This is just a direct consequence of very cambered profiles that are left alone without washout, and this is the consequence. I personally don't like it so much because I see the response from pilots is that whenever things go wrong and that the glider doesn't do that, they like the glider, you know. But Manfred was very successful with the Icaro concept, and those profiles were more pitchy, as we say, but they also have a little more nominal deformance, so it's hard to tell what is better. Because we had a shortage in this information that every single model at the Europeans had a reference given, we would have to basically just take the numbers first and then sort of see where we really stand. A very interesting thing out of that is that now Civil, Dennis Fagan, can draw a graph where he would basically not tell individual pilots what they have and what the other guys have, and so you can start fighting. But they would show you your own numbers compared to the others, you know. So you do a distribution like a bell shape around what is commonly used. Not necessarily what is certification limit, and also not what is safe, because we don't know these two. You know, they are not the same, and they are also not really known. But at least you know, for instance, that everyone would be around, say, 5 degrees on that inner dive stick. You are at 2 degrees. Means you're way out, you know, and that should make you think. That was something that actually happened. People realized, shit, I'm really just way too low. I'm raising the dive sticks a full turn and I'm still not feeling the difference. I might just leave it there because they were already floating in the safe, you know. Another interesting thing must have been for many, I'd say, middle good pilots, you know, in the ranks between 30 and 50, that the top pilots were not really on the low setup they would always expect, you know. You can imagine when my glider was measured, there was about 20 guys around. Everybody said, now we gotta find out. Now we gotta find out. And everybody was disappointed. I was, of course, lower than the German limit, which I think is too high, and which I think is also the reason why we do not care enough about that limit. Because when it is so high that everybody feels this is not racy, then you take it in your own hands. And we had a discussion about that in the civil meeting, and I said what we need next, when we do a testing against a certain limit that is really high, we should also do a second test to see what washout angle do you need to have zero pitch. Why is that so interesting? The German limit for 100 kilometer speed on weightless is 200 Newton meters. The American limit is 0. So these are the two most important testing bodies, and they basically totally disagree on how much is safe. You know, there's a long way between 200 and 0. You know, the Brits be somewhere in between with their measurements, and if we would have a world standard, I think would be actually closest to the British limit, because that will be where the compromise is, you know. So they just were the last ones to come on board with their limits, and they were already probably considering that some of the American testing is too harsh and some of the German limits is also too high. And what pilots traditionally, pro pilots, made out of that is that they were just guessing themselves something up. And personally, I think what Manfred and I were doing over the years, by having some experience with the car and then also comp experience, we would be somewhere like PHV half or so, maybe PHV third, which is still higher than the American limit was. You know? So in saying we need to find out what washout angle do we need for zero pitch, we would learn a very important information, and that is, imagine back on the light speed, 7.5 and 5.5 is giving you the German limit. Now thinking half of that, 7.5 and 5.5, will give you 100, which is half the limit, is totally wrong. Why is that? Why is that so? Why is zero washout not zero pitch? The reason is that all these profiles that we use have camber. You know, we wouldn't climb if they were having no pitch moment and if they had not that much camber. So you would have to give a certain amount of washout. I would say, let me guess, 3 degrees inboard and probably like 4 degrees outboard to reach the zero. And only from there on you build pitch in the amount of 200 if you go that high. And that is exactly the reason that I see why we had that fatality, you know, like 2 days into the meet, we had measured half the gliders. The procedure that the CIVL had, I very much liked. They kept it basically personal. I would measure your glider and say, look, this is your numbers. I can show you what I have done so far. Average numbers on your model would be